1 second. Right, very good. Very good afternoon. No, you're next to me, Jemilah. You're next to me. That's your microphone. That's your microphone. There we go. Very good afternoon. Can you believe it? We're all here again. Before we begin, do we have, besides the good doctor here, do we have any more Davos virgins here? Davos virgin, oh my word.
Thank you for joining us.
Davos virgin. Right, so anyone 0 to 5 years of Davos? 5 to 10? 10 to 15? 20 above? I know. It's pathetic, isn't it? You'd have thought I'd have found a way out of it by now. People always say to me, how has it changed? Truth is, it hasn't. The numbers have remained the same. The politickings remain the same. Yeah, sometimes it's fourth industrial revolution, and sometimes it's AI like now, and it's always the same. But listen, today we are here to discuss the energy transition, specifically as it relates to LNG. Now, before we hear from our panel, Professor Bob Warren, Sam Reynolds, Dr. Jemilah Mahmood, and they will introduce themselves, because if I try and do long introductions, it'll go wrong. Who in here actually is knowledgeable on climate science, besides the panel? Oh, well done. Sorry? Yes. Oh, well.
Knowledge is only from the seed to the ocean to the sky to the technology that we measure and monitor biodiversity and that of science that can be effective to feed the world. So yes, we're here.
Right.
Are we done?
We can see how we haven't even started, and there's troublemakers.
We need her on the panel.
Absolutely. All right, so I am not a climate specialist in any shape or form, but I will be testing our panel here who are. And I'm starting with you, Bob. First of all, what is the central thesis of what we are talking about today in terms of LNG, liquid natural gas, that everybody believes is the great savior of our energy transition?
Is this on?
No. Go ahead. Yes, it is. It'll pick you up.
Yeah, thank you. Just background, Bob Howarth. I'm an Earth System scientist. I'm a faculty member at Cornell University, Ithaca, New York, USA. I'm an expert on methane, and methane has a lot to do with liquefied natural gas. What we're talking about is a huge increase in the movement of natural gas by ships. We're taking, in the case of the United States, we're the largest exporter of LNG now. We didn't export anything until 2016. You're taking shale gas from hydraulic fracturing, you're supercooling it to produce liquefied natural gas, transporting it by ship. It's extremely energy intensive. Carbon dioxide emissions are reasonably high, but the direct emissions from burning carbon dioxide from the fuel are only 1/3 of the story. Methane emissions are greater, and methane is a greenhouse gas. It's responsible for 1/3 of all climate warming since we've had the Industrial Revolution. And in the case of liquefied natural gas, since methane is 80 times more powerful than carbon dioxide as a gas, small methane emissions add up. And according to my research, LNG has the largest greenhouse gas footprint of any fossil fuel.
Now, that piece of research is highly controversial.
It's new, it's controversial, it runs against the messaging from the oil and gas industry, but I think it's well supported by the science as a whole.
Oh, come on. You came out with a piece of research that basically get the equivalent in the industry of the earth is flat. You basically said to everybody, the thing that you are promoting as being the number one transitional fuel is actually worse than that stuff called coal.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's what my paper says. And if you look back at the whole idea of gas as a transition fuel, it's based on the fact that when you burn coal versus gas, the carbon dioxide emissions to get the same amount of energy are substantially less for gas. It's less true for LNG than for other gas because you use all this energy to liquefy it, transport it, and all. But natural gas is methane. You cannot develop and use it without having some go unburned to the atmosphere. And because it's 80 times more powerful, you add that all in, and it has a larger greenhouse gas footprint than coal.
All right, Sam. He's basically telling us that it's awful. You're going to tell me what?
Okay, Sam Reynolds here from the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis. We're a global research group focused on the energy and financial impacts of the global energy transition. Bob here is making the argument that LNG is worse for the climate than coal. I'm here to make a much easier and more obvious answer, which that LNG is much worse economically than coal and other renewable energy resources, particularly in the largest target markets for LNG growth, right? The oil and gas industry is investing in LNG over the long term, well past 2050, by building new infrastructure, signing new contracts. My view, however, is that they are betting on demand growth in parts of the world that simply cannot afford LNG.
Why are they doing it? If you assume that nobody wants a world that's worse for their children or their dogs, why are they doing it? Are they evil?
Look at where we are right now. We are coming out of 2022, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, in which globally prices for LNG skyrocketed. They reached record levels, right? The value of a single shipment of LNG went from essentially zero during the COVID-19 pandemic when nobody was buying LNG, to the height of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, in which you could earn $250 to $350 million per shipment of LNG. So just to finish that thought, we are coming out of a super cycle for LNG, and I think yeah.
No, because that's too short a time frame, because the sudden love affair, the sudden spike in price of LNG post-Russian invasion was predicated on the previous 20-odd years of being told that LNG is the savior of all. So suddenly everybody was preconditioned to this idea that LNG was the answer.
That's true, but over the next 4 years, we are going to see nearly 5 times the amount of LNG export capacity come online than in the previous 4 years. We are headed for an unprecedented growth in LNG supply globally. So much so that I think over the next decade, we're going to start to see an LNG glut form.
If you assume that the people making the decisions, politicians, business, people who own electric companies, et cetera, just for the purposes of this question, assume they are neither evil, corrupt, or stupid. Why are they doing it?
Well, I just broke it down because a single shipment could earn $250 million in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Everybody jumped, everybody that wanted and could supply LNG jumped whole hog into building new facilities. At the same time, what do high prices mean for the buyer? Bad news, right? And so we saw a shift away from LNG on the demand side, and that's my ultimate point, is there is a fundamental economic disconnect between the suppliers and the buyers of LNG, one that is going to come back to bite all of these investors in LNG facilities today.
So you're basically saying neither evil, bad, corrupt, but just greedy.
Absolutely.
I'm glad we clarified that. Yes, ma'am.
So I'm Jemilah Mahmood. I come from Malaysia, and I'm executive director of a Sunway Center for Planetary Health at Sunway University. I'm a health practitioner, and I'm here really because I have been working in the humanitarian sector for more than 25 years prior to this, and I've seen the challenges
close up
Which are what?
on climate change, the impact on people. And I'm really here, while we're enjoying the clean air of Davos, to bring the human face and the human realities of people who don't make it to Davos, people who are going to suffer the health impacts of LNG and other fossil fuels.
All right. What are the health impacts of LNG that are greater above and beyond those of other fossil fuels?
It's not about comparing what is better or what is worse. It's all fossil fuels are harmful, but LNG, which is touted to be safer, is not. So from the production of LNG itself, the fracking itself produces all sorts of harmful volatile compounds, and the flaring that happens produces benzene. These are causing cancer, causing respiratory illness. And there are so many stories I can tell you about this.
So what do you want?
I would like people to know that there are good health co-benefits if we go to renewables as rapidly as possible. It's good for people, but it's also good for the economy. And I think we need to put the future generations in this room. It's about intergenerational justice. We owe it to future generations to ensure that they have clean air, they have clean water, and a right to good health.
Yeah, I'm not letting you get away with that.
Okay.
Because I've never met a politician or a CEO of an oil company or any company that says, do you know I want to pollute? Do you know I don't want my people to have clean air? Do you know I really want to have the nastiest environment I can possibly bring?
They won't say it.
So you think they want it?
They don't care.
That's a very startling accusation
It is.
to suggest they don't care.
They don't care because profits matter more than people.
So
They
you're on the
don't-
greed side.
They don't see the people who are really suffering.
I don't agree with you on that. I absolutely do not agree with you on that. I think that any politician in any democracy absolutely gets to see the people who are on the other side.
But they
of that.
don't care. They see it, but they don't see it. You understand what I'm saying?
Bob, do they care?
Well, I come at it from the climate perspective, right? And do they care about climate change? I mean, we have climate deniers who are politicians. That's a problem. But even those who believe in it, are they all acting fast enough? They clearly are not. We need to be moving faster.
Yeah.
From the standpoint of the science, climate scientists are clear. We need to live in a fossil fuel-free future by 2050 completely. Fossil fuels are the main driver of climate change. We need to move to a different energy economy.
You are saying that we are 35% at the moment power generation by renewables.
That's correct, as of the moment, globally.
So that's a hell of a distance to make up between now and 2050.
There's a long way, but the renewables are a cheaper source of new electricity than is gas or any other fossil fuel. The economics are powering us there. Climate change demands that we move there. It makes economic sense, it does.
Why then are we not?
Well,
Or are you back with the doctor here? That,
I mean, we are. The amount of renewable electricity is going up remarkably. You look at what's going on in China, remarkable growth in renewables. And you look at, most countries of the world at least have plans, and they make economic sense.
I want to just take a second and remove all personal bias from this conversation. Look at the numbers. European demand for LNG was down 20% last year compared to the year before. Demand is falling rapidly in Japan and South Korea due to energy plans. Those three markets account for 50% of global demand for LNG. Right? So demand in key markets is falling. Where are they moving next? They're moving to South and Southeast Asia, which according to Shell are going to be the largest growth markets for LNG. Now, just to finish this thought, compare Japan, South Korea, and Europe to South and Southeast Asia. Wealthy buyers able to afford the high costs that come with LNG versus much more price-sensitive economies that are going to struggle to pay for that energy import tab.
If you want to take personalities out of it, I'm going to shove them back in again, because that's exactly what you've just done, with respect. What you have basically said is that having lost or losing their developed markets in countries or markets that have learned the lesson of LNG, they are doing the tobacco argument of shifting production and shifting sales to less developed, less sophisticated markets. Is that your argument?
Look, I think there are realities for why the industry is saying this. South and Southeast Asia have some of the fastest economic growth rates in the entire world. Domestic gas production in those regions tends to be falling. Right? So the industry is looking at these kind of macro fundamental realities and saying this region is going to need LNG. I think where they're wrong is they are underestimating the economic barriers to LNG penetrating, especially when there are alternative resources. Now, I'm not talking about clean energy resources. I'm talking about alternatives. I'm talking about coal. I am talking about solar and wind and hydro and batteries and geothermal, as well as searching, which all countries in the region are, for other sources of domestic gas. They're trying to do anything and everything that they can do in order to avoid LNG.
Let's talk about this before we get to renewables. Bob, as between the dirties, coal, oil, LNG, if you're sitting in a country, as Germany was, facing the cutoff of Russian gas, and the Chancellor says, we're going to fire up the coal power stations again. We're switching off. I mean, we can have an argument about was it stupid to switch off nuclear in the first place, but we're going to switch on. And there's a massive green cry. No, you can't switch on coal, dirty, nasty coal. But you would rather they switch on the coal than fire up the gas.
Yes, that's exactly correct. In response to your question, you have a global crisis. It's hopefully a temporary crisis. Europe has been moving as quickly as possible towards a renewable future, putting in heat pumps as well as renewable electricity sources. You do have a short-term problem. Does it make more sense to open those coal plants, which were already there? You're not putting a lot of funds into infrastructure, as opposed to developing new infrastructure for LNG with a terrible funding behind it. Those are going to become stranded assets. That's bad for Germany's economy. It's bad for the global economy. So as much as I hate coal, as much as anyone else, all fossil fuels are bad. But as a temporary thing, yes.
And it comes back to the temporary thing, a crisis situation where you need to go to a source of energy. But let me talk about the economics. You asked about why is it they're not willing to look at it. Well, first of all, I think it's short-termism, looking at quick profits in the short term and not realizing that about 8 million people die as a result of air pollution, and we lose $8.1 trillion a year from air pollution. We've been able to do studies in Malaysia to show that we erode our GDP 5% per annum if we continue doing business as usual. So if there is an economic cost, there is an economic value, and there are huge health co-benefits for going to renewables.
So, well, how did the LNG industry, the largest producer of which is the United States, and then you've got Qatar and a whole variety of others, and how did they manage to convince everybody that LNG was the savior?
That's an excellent question. I never underestimate the marketing folks in big oil and gas. They really are good at marketing things, and LNG is their latest marketing. One thing they've done is have a sleight of hand between conventional gas or shale gas and LNG. It's all the same. Somehow the shale gas from the United States, magically gets moved to Europe or to Korea or wherever without expending the energy it takes to liquefy it and transport it. The energy costs, the emissions which come from LNG are substantially higher than the gas from which it's made. And industry sort of just sleight of hand doesn't even talk about that. So they're using an idea from 15, 20 years ago that gas generally is a bridge fuel, a transitional fuel, while we slowly move to renewables. And I don't think that was ever a really good idea because of the methane issue. But if it were ever true, it's less true now that we're moving into a less and less expensive world for renewables. And again, LNG has a far larger greenhouse gas footprint than does the gas from which it's made.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Bob just said completely. I want to give a tangible example of how this is happening. I mentioned South and Southeast Asia are the largest growth markets. How is the industry getting this done? One way is by going through the power development planning pathways of these countries. Japan here is a good example. Japan historically has been the largest buyer of LNG globally. It has a 60-year experience in developing infrastructure. It is going into South and Southeast Asian countries and helping draft the power development plans of these countries and injecting large volumes of LNG-fired power capacity into the future planning.
What would you have them do instead?
Promote renewables.
All right,
Promote the more cost.
It's not a zero-sum game. They're doing that as well, they would say. They would sit here and say, of course we're promoting renewables. Of course we're doing that.
A
But
far larger share of oil and gas company portfolios is being spent on fossil fuels, particularly LNG.
right, but I'm guessing that certainly I would have said, and maybe a large-ish percentage of the people in this room might believe, as I do, that it is not possible for us to generate the required level of power by renewables at the moment.
Right now, this is a question of electricity demand growth, right? Especially for emerging economies that are growing very quickly. We need to maintain the existing resources that they have, but we need to ensure that their growth is met by renewable and clean projects. And that is exactly what is happening. The IEA says that 2025 and 2026, nearly 100% of added electricity demand will be met through renewable energy.
Let's talk about renewables, Bob, because you were giving me the example of New York, where we both live. What is your preferred renewable?
And I think we need to have a mix of renewables. So in the New York perspective, the plan is to have an equal mix, basically, of solar, wind, and hydro. And then
How do you create enough electricity for something like New York from those three?
well, there's a detailed plan. You know, New York has a very progressive climate law passed in 2019. The law called for a commission to establish that plan. I'm one of 22 people on the commission. The majority of the people are state-appointed commissioners, the head of various state agencies. So this isn't a radical group. We produced a blueprint laying out exactly how to do that. And hydro plays a big role, particularly for New York City. And New York State and New York City have contracted with Hydro-Quebec to bring down a lot of power directly to New York City. Offshore wind is also a big part of it. We're behind targets on that because the inflationary costs in wind power caught the state by surprise. But nonetheless, the overall economics strongly suggest that we can meet all of our electric demand by 2035 in New York from renewables, 100%.
Of course, you'd still need fossils for
Heating and transportation. yeah.
heating, transportation.
And in New York, you know, we're the 10th largest economy in the world if you deconvolute the United States economy. So it's a big economy. If we can do it in New York, anywhere. Our number one use of energy, our number one source of energy use is heat, heating our homes. It's a cold climate. And the way to deal with that is beneficial electrification, heat pumps, extracting heat from the environment using a modest amount of electricity. In a city like New York, we want to do that at the street scale, consolidated heat delivery systems. We probably want to do that in most of the towns and cities of New York. But the plan is there. It's cost effective to do so. The plan, in a cost effective way, says we can reduce our use of natural gas by half statewide by 2035. If we can do it in New York, you can do it anywhere.
What time are we going till? Oh, excellent, excellent. And we'll take a question from the audience. I think is a good moment to.
What about, you did mention nuclear and smart nuclear and innovation in alternative energies that are more modular or smart. So I'd love you to add.
I can, oh, yeah.
Let me
please.
take a
Yeah, sure.
yes. You know, for the New York plan, we discussed nuclear in some depth, and we decided not to go with nuclear. We have some nuclear plants, and the commission voted to keep those operating until their licenses run out. But it was our decision as a commission, and it's my personal professional opinion as well, that we can deploy wind, solar, and hydro more rapidly and more cost effectively than nuclear, so we don't need nuclear.
Is nuclear good to have in your back pocket? Have a couple of nuclear stations there? Because it is real. I mean, the reality is, properly run, it's extremely reliable.
Except when it's not, as when you end up with a heat wave in France and you can no longer cool the plants until they have to shut down. If you look at the overall capacity of nuclear power, say in Europe or the US, it's not all that reliable.
I want to add that certainly nuclear presents challenges for LNG demand, right? Japan, formerly the largest buyer of LNG in the world, started bringing back online its nuclear reactors in 2014. And we saw a direct correlation between its nuclear generation capacity online and its LNG demand, which has fallen 25% over the last decade. In terms of what you mentioned, small modular reactors, conventional nuclear in the United States certainly is dead, following Vogtle. It's out. I mean, it's too expensive. Construction timelines are too overblown. The small modular reactor industry is saying that it can solve all of those problems, that they can be built more cheaply and on time. And neither of those things has proven to be true. How many small modular reactors can you name that are in the world operating? There are only about 3, right?
Nova Scotia, they'll be in the next. Canada finally brought it in, but they had an issue where they had to.
Sure.
Right.
Costs for small modular reactors are still 200 to 400 times what are being promised from the outset. Construction timelines, they're claiming 3 to 4 years. The ones that are operational are
what
showing
is your
construction
preferred?
timelines of 14 to 15 years.
What is your preferred?
My preferred is a mix, particularly in South and Southeast Asia, that minimizes the role for expensive LNG and maximizes the role for cheaper, low-cost renewable energy resources.
I completely agree, and I think that, again, coming back to energy access, we're talking about 760 million people who don't have access to energy. So that acceleration, of renewables is going to be important because it's cheap and it's affordable and it can go to people who need energy.
You see, your problem is that you can all be right and you're losing the argument.
I don't think we are.
Well, hang on, let me finish. You can all be right on the economics, and you can be right on the health, and you can be right on the dirtiness, but you have already lost the court of public opinion amongst politicians and in terms of everybody believes LNG is a better solution.
That was wrong, uninformed opinion. And we're here to try and help counteract it, and we're just delighted that you're allowing us to help address that issue. That's not the case. LNG is bad for the climate, bad for health, bad for the economy. There are better alternatives, and they're there and available today.
Richard, I'm going to agree with you that in a way we've lost because we, as scientists, as health practitioners, have not been able to communicate to the voters who put these leaders into their leadership positions on science in a way that they understand.
Why?
I think it's because we haven't invested in that. The fossil fuel lobby have invested in this, and I think we need to do a better job. The fact is that education, good governance, good communication is really demystifying the science.
Take another question. Yeah, we'll come to you in a second.
Yeah,
Sir.
I'm from Qatar. I'm based in Qatar for the last 25 years. I just wanted to say that you talked about the logistics and transport, generating the CO2 emissions more than the production, because we have clean natural gas relatively. And a lot of the time that gas is diverted all the way to the UAE, to Oman, through networks. It's not compressed, it's not liquefied, it's diverted. Secondly, it's pushed into the industries like, producing petrochemicals, etc., etc. There's a lot of diversions locally.
Right, but what about the leakage and the methane leakage that takes place during the distribution process?
There is certain amount of, flaring, but the flares have been upgraded at significant cost in Qatar. I mean, I'm a contractor. Secondly, I would say that leakage is dangerous and hazardous anyway, and there's a lot of technology that's gone into preventing that. So, relatively speaking, the oil and gas industry is doing as much as it can, but it's not doing enough, clearly. But I'm just saying.
And that probably varies depending on regions and countries for sure, and companies.
The point I wanted to make is that if you switch to burning coal, in in 1953 we had a smog in London.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh,
I
no.
think I think the coal example, the coal example is in extremis, as you know, when push comes to shove, and you have to make a
You're
choice.
in a disaster situation for a few years, coal. But let me pick up on one aspect which came up, methane leaks. We're not really talking about leakage per se. We're talking about emissions to the atmosphere as part of the operations of the process. Now, if you get into a city like New York or London, there are leaks in the distribution system, but much more importantly are the flares which go out and you're putting unburned methane into the atmosphere. Even when the flare is working properly, some of the methane slips through unburned. When you run compressor stations for high pressure pipelines, methane is associated with those. When you do maintenance on a pipeline, you can't weld on a pipeline full of methane gas, so you blow it off to the atmosphere, what's called a blowdown. Most of the emissions, and certainly in my analysis, 80% of the emissions I'm talking about are not leaks. You don't go through the pipe and fix it. It's a purposeful part of the operations of the industry.
Before we take another question, there are plenty more questions. We're going to come to Madam next, but before we do, Bob, can I just attack you?
Please do.
Well, give you the chance to respond. Your critics, they say your research, however good it is, it's not been peer reviewed, it was rushed out, it was published too soon, and that you have transgressed from science to activism.
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. And that is indeed what some critics would say.
The industry says that about you.
Well, of course they do. They don't like my messaging. Let me refer specifically to my paper on liquefied natural gas. It was published in a peer-reviewed journal in late September of this year. It went through extensive peer review. It's held up quite well. I did put out a preprint, pre-publication version of the paper in October of 2023. I made it publicly available. I said it was not peer-reviewed. I updated it during the peer-reviewed process. Was it rushed? No. Why did I make it available? Because I thought the conclusions were so strong and I thought the public should be aware of it.
Did anything come out of the peer review that changed the fundamental point that you were making?
No, fundamentally not. I mean, my paper in the end is a stronger paper. It's clearer. The equations are easier to follow. The language is easier to follow. The conclusions are the same.
Madam.
So my question is, when we talk about LNG as an indirect fuel, one way is to use it as a standalone fuel. The other is to use it as feedstock for producing, let us say, hydrogen, which is another cleaner fuel. So what is your view of that, especially from the fact that can we use the supply chains of existing LNG at least to support hydrogen acceptance till the time, the hydrogen supply chain is catching up? And this is more from, from the point that we all understand we need renewable energy, but how to do it in the immediate form.
Well, let me address the hydrogen per se, because I think hydrogen made from natural gas is also a climate disaster. Also, it's a very large greenhouse gas footprint. And Mark Jacobson of Stanford and I published a paper of that, peer-reviewed back in 2021. It's held up quite well. The emissions were very, very high, even if you put carbon dioxide capture on it. Is there a role for hydrogen in our future? Yes, but I think it's been overhyped, quite frankly, by some interests. And the hydrogen should be coming not from fossil fuels, but from renewable electricity. We should be very careful with that.
There's a lot of talk about hydrogen-ready infrastructure, and there's a lot of research and testing that still has to be done in order to get to the point where we can say that's going to be a reality. I do know that when you talk about power plants blending hydrogen, the benefits of doing so are going to be minimal for the climate until you reach very high levels of penetration. And when you're using green hydrogen, meaning hydrogen produced from renewable energy, the electricity is going to be better used just sending it directly into the grid rather than converting it into hydrogen and then back through the power plant and back into electricity. I think it's going to be much, much cheaper to go directly to renewables.
Just to build on that a little bit, we looked at that specifically in the case of New York and trying to minimize our greenhouse gas footprint for heating. And so, industry came and said, this electrification is expensive. We think we should use the pipeline structure and put hydrogen into it. It's difficult to do that, as I say, but let's say we start with 1 unit of renewable electricity. If we put it into hydrogen, deliver the hydrogen to the home, burn it, it's expensive. It also, you lose about 20% of the energy overall. If you take that unit of electricity instead and use it in a high efficiency heat pump, you get 5 to 10 times more heat energy out in the home. Far, far more effective.
Gentleman over there, sir.
I have a
And cows.
You don't want to go into. Well, there's some debate and disagreement in the field on that. But among the fossil fuels, oil and gas are the primary ones. Sometimes it's a little difficult to separate those out. We were talking about the Permian Basin earlier. A lot of the gas there is co-produced from oil, and it's difficult. Coal, certainly there's some leakage of methane from coal, but keep in mind that methane is a contaminant, a small contaminant of coal, whereas natural gas is methane. And so the emissions per energy developed are the highest for methane, followed by oil and then coal.
Before we come to your question, many of us get weary of constantly being told everything that's bad for us. We were talking about this earlier with health. You know, meat, all that methane, to say nothing of the what it does to the cholesterol, and no one has for the body effect. Gewalt. I mean, now you're telling us LNG. We've spent the last 30-odd years being told LNG is the savior. You come along and tell us that it's the biggest disaster since sliced bread, white sliced bread. What can we do?
This is where I come back to communications. Show people the benefits. I think, the doom and gloom scenario alone is not good enough. If
People like you promote the doom and gloom scenario.
No, I don't. I always talk about co-benefits. I always I paint a picture of hope.
Well, he does.
No.
But that's his job.
For New York, yeah. I don't like talking negatives all the time, which is why I like renewable energy. But look at the New York plan. It's cost effective. It'd be good for our economy. There are, in the New York status, 100 times more job in a renewable energy economy than in the fossil fuel economy. It's good for health. We now estimate that we have 4,000 premature deaths in New York from fossil fuel air pollution every year, not to mention sick days and all. It's better for health, better for the economy, better for jobs.
That's a positive spin.
Importing countries are starting to see the writing on the wall when it comes to
Right.
high cost. Pakistan agreed to stop building LNG-fired power plants altogether in 2023. It is now the 6th largest solar market in the entire world.
We'll take another question, sir.
So, hi, my name is Niels Bolzon. I have a question regarding the energy security that LNG is giving. The panel agreed that Germany was right to turn on coal for the emergency, so to say. Isn't it right then to have LNG infrastructure built instead of coal for all the emerging countries now?
Good question.
Well, let me take a quick stack of that. From an energy security standpoint, I would not think anyone would want to rely on LNG. Certainly not from the United States. We banned the export of LNG from the United States until 2016. Now we're the world's largest exporter, and that's growing rapidly. We have repeated changes in our political structure. We're not a stable democracy, if you look at us that way.
I'm glad we mentioned that.
I personally would not want to be dependent on future LNG coming from my country if I
All
were
right,
another
let me
country.
just ask you. By the end of today, it is highly likely that a raft of executive orders will have been issued that will essentially reverse that which has been done in the last 4, but also arguably put the LNG industry on steroids.
I want to challenge the idea that this is a reversal, particularly in the United States. The U.S. already had 7 LNG export terminals under construction under the Biden administration that were immune to the Biden administration's pause on federal approvals for export terminals. So the U.S. already had a large share of capacity being built. That's not to say that more won't be built. But at the same time, some of the largest trading partners, namely Europe, namely Japan, demand is falling, right? So LNG the Trump administration is not going to change the overall economic trajectory of LNG relative to fossil
It will
fuels.
change
Now,
the perspective.
one final point that I would like to make here
Go ahead.
is that to what extent is Trump's strategy to LNG going to backfire? During Trump's first term, his trade war with China caused Chinese imports of U.S. LNG to fall to 0. And he's threatening even higher tariffs on China this administration than he was in the last one. So there's a real possibility that U.S. LNG becomes the subject of retaliation against this tariff and trade bullying.
Before we come to you, but this concept of drill, baby, drill.
I think it's a political slogan. You know, We are the world's largest producer of natural gas, largest exporter of liquefied natural
And
gas,
oil.
largest producer of oil. None of that was true a decade or so ago. So we're already on that trajectory. The world is moving towards a fossil fuel-free future. We might postpone that movement unnecessarily in the United States, but the long-term trajectory is moving the other way.
You see,
Now,
that
let me say one more thing about about how this could backfire, though, because in the European perspective, we often hear that the interest in LNG is if it's certified as being low emissions, low methane emissions. That argument's going to fall apart in the face of the dismantling of the methane rules in the U.S. I think it's already a bit of a charade, but the dismantling of that executive order, I think, will do harm to the LNG industry.
Sir.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Vivek from Influence Map. We look at how the corporate sector influences climate policy. So firstly, on the methane regulations, we've seen the oil and gas industry, particularly in the US, advocate heavily to weaken and repeal all of the methane regulations proposed. And now we have no idea whether, well, we have some idea, whether they're going to be withdrawn through executive orders, as you mentioned. But I just wanted to ask the panel, based on the health, economic and climate impacts of LNG, would you say it's a dead end?
Sorry.
Would you classify it as a dead end,
What?
LNG?
You mean? I'm sorry. I'm not.
Is it what it's being proposed as?
Right.
I think the the panel has already shown that the cost of production of LNG, the diminishing demand, means that it is a dead end. So, why is there investment in something which is actually not going to give you the economic return in the long term?
But the problem you've got, see, this is your difficulty, is it's already there, and it's growing, and there's vast infrastructure, and there is now serious vested interest in at least maintaining that which is there, if not growing it even more. That's your problem.
Back in 2016, the world was going through a glut of LNG. The industry was very concerned about quote unquote homeless LNG because demand at the time was floundering, right? And the concern is not necessarily that they'll be able to sell the cargoes, it's that they'll be able to sell the cargoes at a rate that they earn their money back in doing so. And that's really what's at play for me, is that there is serious financial risk in continued investment in a fuel that is going to experience a glut.
Any more questions, by the way? Let's just catch. Oh, plenty more. There we go. Yes, I'm so sorry. Do forgive me. My back's been to you. Forgive me.
It's fine.
Just shout.
Loud, yeah, noisy. My name is Chris. I'm from Climeworks. We're a carbon company, but this is a personal question. So I'm originally from China. I live in Singapore. China is very reliant on coal, and what we've been hearing about is that coal created all of those haze situations. But when I moved to Singapore, which is heavily reliant on LNG, it seems to be no hazy days. Then I want to ask, yes, I understand your point regarding the greenhouse gas emissions. What about the other air pollutants? Is LNG also worse than coal?
Doctor.
I live across the causeway from you. I can promise you there are hazy days in Singapore and Malaysia. So I don't get why you say there are no hazy days. I've been back to China.
Maybe he lives in a better area.
No, I've been back to China a couple of times, and I think the quality of air has just drastically improved. So I think that argument I would question. But the other thing I would say is that on the harmful elements, all of the fossil fuels produce harmful elements, but particularly in LNG, the fracking, the flaring, they're causing specific emissions of volatile organic compounds. It is actually causing cancer. It is actually causing a massive rise in respiratory illness and cardiovascular diseases.
I just want to, say coal is a terrible fuel, right? So don't get me wrong. I'm not advocating for coal, except perhaps for a very, very short-term emergency sort of situation. The fact is the world needs to move away from all fossil fuels. We need to cut our use of fossil fuels in half by 2035 or so, and we need to be largely fossil fuel-free by 2050. And given that context, we should not be putting financial resources into building LNG infrastructure.
See,
we should use that for the renewable infrastructure.
Here is the difficulty with this. The fossil fuel industry, and we certainly saw it at COP in the UAE, the fossil fuel industry sort of sits back and says, You're going to need us for the foreseeable future. And you're going to have to invest in, whether it be an LNG plant, whatever, nuclear plant, an oil plant, a coal plant. You are going to need us for at least the next 50 years. And they're right.
I think they're wrong. No, the world has to move away from fossil fuels much more quickly than that. I think we can. I think it'll catch the industry off guard in terms of the speed if they don't realize what's going on.
In China, I would just want to respond to that question very briefly. Because it's such an important argument the LNG industry is making, that LNG can displace coal in emerging economies. My point is that LNG is too expensive to displace coal. If you think that LNG is economically going to replace coal in these economies, you got to look again. And that's exactly what's happening in China. The share of gas-fired power generation is falling. It's not going up.
We will take a couple more questions and then we will conclude. Yes, sir.
Paul Simpson from ERM, the Sustainability Consultancy. Two quick questions. Can you just comment about the quality of data on methane leakage in the gas supply chain? Because I did a project recently and it's terrible, in my opinion. There's people using data from 2015, some have got satellites, some haven't. So it just...
Why do you think that is? The data's bad.
Well, because if people were willing to pay for it, then the quality will improve. But it's just the way the industry works. And also, some of the industry doesn't want really good quality data because it's quite high leakage.
Yep.
And just the second question has just been discussed. You know, when an industry invests in a lot of infrastructure that it plans to run for a number of years, it finds it very hard to turn it off, so it lobbies to keep it going, unless it has a transition plan to something else, less environmentally health impactful. Is there anything, you know, because sometimes it's said for the gas supply infrastructure, you could use it for hydrogen. I take your point on hydrogen. Hydrogen has, I think, a role in a few, so not for heating homes or anything like that, but big industrial, so can you use the same infrastructure for that?
It may. Let me sidestep the hydrogen and go to the methane. And again, it's not leakage per se. There's some leakage, but it's methane emissions, and a larger of it's a purposeful part of the operations. You know, if we go back 10 or 15 years ago, we had very, very poor idea of what those emissions are. I and Tony Ingraffia and Renee Santoro published a paper back in 2011 on methane emissions from shale gas. First paper ever published, and we said it could be bad, right? Quality of the data were terrible. We said that. So let's get out and make more measurements. Well, now our paper, which was published, 13, 14 years ago, has been cited by over 2,000 other papers where people have made those measurements. For my paper on the LNG footprint, I used a summary that was published in the journal Nature this past March. They pulled together all of the available data for them with a U.S. focus. It's based on about 1 million observations. So in the United States, we now have a very good handle on the methane emissions. Globally, we don't. And overall, I think every country in the world underestimates it because they rely on industry self-reporting, and there are financial reasons for industry to lowball it.
The second part to his question.
I don't have an answer to the second part of your question, other than I think it's a very good point. As this glut starts to materialize, the industry is going to look for alternative conversion options for the infrastructure. It already is. On the method,
That is the core. I mean, to an extent, he's put his finger on the problem.
Absolutely, absolutely. How is the industry going to convert that infrastructure when it realizes that it's in a period of major
And
oversupply?
at that point, the industry will put its entire weight behind promoting the next thing, which will have the benefit.
And that's exactly my point too, is that the industry has gotten itself into a major financial quagmire by doing this. Yeah.
Sir,
I have a quick question on, are you making this maybe a little bit too complicated? Isn't it very, very obvious that moving off fossil fuels, including LNG, is good for everyone except for the profits of the companies that are invested in? They all rely on a story of growth and expansion. It's in all the numbers. And this is sort of the one card, the last card, LNG, that if you stop expanding this, the whole house of cards will come tumbling down. And now, is that wrong? Or is it just the marketing genius by now that's holding this story up?
I think that's exactly right. I don't have much to add other than I think that's exactly right.
It is exactly what people like you and me would agree on, but it's not happening because the industry is pushing in a different direction.
It's a great summary, and If you're right, and I agree, then it's the last hurrah of this industry, right?
I think you might have the last question unless there's anybody else that wants to go after this, in which case it had better be a good one.
Yeah, thank you. See, I'm from India, so see, the demand for LNG is increasing, and India.
Sorry?
The demand for LNG import is increasing, and India is also among the top 5 importers when we talk of LNG import. But there is another important factor when we talk of is how much is my total, the average cost of generation of electricity. So India is still having, I'll say the mixed basket of both conventional and renewable. So when we talk of LNG, so, the one important factor is my commercial aspect for all the developers who are generating the electricity. What is my landed cost? Although we all say how much renewable, right? But ultimately, when we compare with, say, New York, we always say, okay, 100%.
Right.
Yeah. So for emerging economies, I think the mixed basket will continue, both conventional and renewable. So what is your take on that?
Sir.
I think rising penetration of LNG in these energy mixes of these economies, like India and Bangladesh, are going to confront economic realities. Bangladesh is already confronting that since it started importing LNG. Subsidies are through the roof. Gas prices for power are through the roof. And economic activity is falling because of the higher costs.
But if the renewable option is not there yet, then they will have to continue with the LNG even at the higher prices, with all the implications that means for the balance of trade.
LNG has been a very short-term solution, a short-term Band-Aid solution until economies can transition quickly. That's exactly what happened in Europe, and that's exactly what happened in Japan.
I'm going to give each of you the last word. Make it good.
I'm just going to go back to what the gentleman said, and I would say that India is making rapid progress in renewables. I think it's not a matter of when or if, it's a matter of the fact that they have to do it, right?
Go on, you can have a last word.
Okay, so I think I just want you all to take a moment to reflect on the current situation. The World Economic Forum Global Risk Report has been really scary.
Good God, you didn't read that, did you?
I think it's really important that we put people at the center of it all, whether it's every person on Earth, and the impact of LNG and fossil fuels is devastating on their health.
You get the data. Your last word.
My last word is look at the data. Take your own opinions out of it. Look at what's happening with gas demand in the largest growth markets. You'll see the challenges, and they should not be underestimated.
Rob, your last word, but I'm going to preface yours with,
Yours.
you are essentially telling us that the world is flat.
And the world is not flat. No, but the world.
No, I mean from our previous conditioning that LNG is the savior of.
LNG is not the savior. Climate change is real. It's becoming more and more manifest as we warm through 1.5 degrees Celsius. We're on the threshold of doing that. As we move to at COP21, the countries of the world said that's dangerous, dangerous territory because of the probability of higher risks of irreversible thresholds in the climate system, causing irreversible damage to our societies. Fossil fuel emissions are the overwhelming cause of that. We need to be free of fossil fuels completely by 2050, cut it in half by 2035. LNG is the worst of the fossil fuels from a climate perspective. It's no bridge fuel at all.
I'm very grateful to the panel. I would ask those of you who are here for the first time, do try and get on the mountain and ski, if you can. And if you really want your Davos experience, you have to go to Barry's, which is just behind Blackrock, and sing karaoke at 2 o'clock in the morning. Only then can you say you have done Davos. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you.